So good morning again. So first of all, I want to thank Professor EFFROS being here. Thank you. And then a little presentation of this professor. Professor EFFROS is a professor of history at the University of Florida, and she's the director of the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere. She earned the PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, and she studied mostly the funerary world. Her research and teaching address a number of chronological and thematic fields, including early medieval history and archaeology, history of archaeology, and gender history. Professor EFFROS' early work focused on interpreting burial ritual in early medieval communities, and she focused on the study of written and archaeological sources related to the treatment and burial of dead in post-Roman Gaul. She studied also early medieval feasting and fasting rituals, and this allowed her to explore the life ways of marginalized groups, in particular women. And in the last few years, 7 years I think, she focused mostly on the Merovingian world and the traces of the Christianity in the Merovingian world, focusing mostly on the long forgotten cemeteries found of this Merovingian period. And today she will speak about the traces of Christianity in French with 2 study cases. So, thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Is that good? Okay. So today, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you, of course, for being here at this hour in the morning. If we tried to hold a lecture at this time at the University of Florida, I think the room would be completely empty. So our students like to sleep a little bit later, so we don't schedule anything before noon. But in any case, I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to be talking today about a site called the Hypogée des Dunes. How many of you are familiar with the site? Does anybody? No? Okay. All right. So it's a very enigmatic site. I'm going to be showing you some pictures of it because it's recently been re-excavated. This year I'm in Poitiers for the year, where the Hypogée des Dunes is a very important site. It's one of the earliest Christian ones. But because for the past, I'd say about 15 years, I've been working on the history of archaeology, I'm also interested in the impact of this site on the way in which the early medieval period was understood in the 19th and, of course, now later, the period that succeeded it. So the site itself was found in 1879. And essentially, the discovery of the site of the Hypogée des Dunes was precipitated in Poitiers, in the southwest of France, by the construction of military defenses outside of the city, on a hill that was overlooking the city. Poitiers, still today, is a very important center for the military in France. One of the commanders of the site, who was responsible for the engineering unit at Poitiers, discovered some human remains and archaeological remains, and at the time of the discovery, he called in a man named the Père de la Croix. Père de la Croix was a Belgian Jesuit who was working in Poitiers. He had been brought there to teach music. But in the meantime, he had become very interested in archaeology. In the late 19th century, this was increasingly a trend. People were interested in local history, and archaeology was a very important means of accessing the history. And in France, most of these studies were actually conducted in the provinces. There were archaeologists in Paris. There were some important ones, particularly during the period in which Paris was restructured during what's known as the Haussmann era. But in most parts of France, it was really something that interested local savants, in other words, local scholars who wanted to learn something about the places in which they lived, and they took great pride in their cities. So Camille Delacroix came to the site. He had about a year's worth of excavation. In this period, there was no professional training for archaeology. It was something that people essentially learned by excavating. But as a result of the invitation from Commander Rothman, he was able then to, and here I'll show you an image of Père Delacroix later in his life. He went out to the site and took a look. One of the very first things that he found at the site was a Gallo-Roman cemetery. It was dated, he thought, from the first 4 centuries of this era. He also, so he found about 313 graves. He also found an ancient Roman road that passed nearby. He returned to the site the following January, in January of 1879. And at this time, he found what he determined to be probably 6th to 7th century graves. And he found a subterranean structure, in other words, a structure that was below the surface of the earth, which he believed was a martyrium. In other words, a place in which martyrs had been buried and others as well. He found the remains of approximately 35 individuals who were buried at the site. And at the time when he opened it, he said that the mausoleum, this burial chamber, was very, very brightly colored. And it contained sculptural remains as well as inscriptions. And these are some of the modern photos. Unfortunately, one of the things that happened when he opened up the grave is that immediately it began to deteriorate. The colors faded. Unfortunately, you can see here too, this is a much more recent. There's a problem with salt on the interior, just like here with the Giotto frescoes. The interior of the mausoleum is too damp now that it's been exposed to the air. He was very concerned. You can also see that it must have sparkled because of the use of glass that was inside this interior. So to aid him in examining the skeletal remains that were found there, he brought in a physician from the local medical school. He also brought some local priests to the site because of his interest in and the fact that he was convinced that this was an important Christian site. So he wanted the church to be represented there as well. Now, one of the very interesting things from the excavation that he found were fresco remains that contained inscriptions. Unfortunately, he didn't use photography to document them. Instead, he painted them himself. And this is an image that's from his publication on the topic that appeared 4 years later. Based upon his reading of the inscription, there's a first inscription. This one vanished very quickly because he erased it in order to see what was underneath. He could see there was an older inscription underneath. But on the basis of the inscription, he said that the site had belonged to martyrs. And because there was a cleric named in, actually not the painted inscription, but in the sculpted remains that are here on the engraved inscription, he noted that because of a cleric named Mellobaudes, who's named on the inscription here, and because of Gregory of Tours' mention in the Miracles of St. Martin, a priest named Merobaudes, he believed, he made a very tenuous argument, that in fact this was the site that was built to receive the remains of 72 martyrs who came from Poitiers. And it's important to keep this in mind because no one had ever heard of these martyrs before. He claimed that the 72 martyrs came from Poitiers. Originally, he argued that these were 4th century martyrs, but then he later changed the dating because of pressure from his colleagues who said that there was no way that this was from the 4th century. He changed the dating to the late 6th or the 7th century and said that these must have been martyrs of the Visigothic or Arian attacks of the later period. He was drawn also to his interpretation of this site as a martyrium as a consequence of the fact that the local people referred to this site as the Chemin des Martyrs, or Chiron Martyr, suggesting there was a local tradition that this was a martyrial site. It's thought, in fact, that Père de la Croix intended to turn this into a church where pilgrims could continue to come to the site of the Hypogée, well, he called it the Hypogée Martyrium, now it's known as the Hypogée des Dunes, so that people could make pilgrimage to these sites. But the Jesuits, in fact, were too concerned about the uproar that this might cause, and this never occurred. But nonetheless, Père de la Croix purchased the martyrium because he wanted to be able to control its destiny. And he later, in his will, when he died in 1911, he left it to the Archaeological Society, the Société des Antiquaires de l'Ouest, of which he was a member. This was the most important archaeological society in Poitiers and the surrounding region. Now, I should point out that today, no one thinks that this is a martyrium. There's no dispute that there may have been relics in this location, but no one today argues still, at least that I'm aware of, that this was a martyrium. This was a moment in time, at the time when the Jesuits, and I'll speak about this in a little while, were under extreme attack in France, that they were forced to shut down a year after the discovery of this tomb. They lost their property, and several years after that, they were forbidden to teach anymore in not public schools, but religious schools in France, during a period in French history that was characterized by increasing anti-clericalism, negative feelings towards the formal church, and ultimately what led to the separation of church and state in France in 1905. So this is a very, very fraught moment in the history of the site. Now, the site has been recently re-excavated, as I mentioned, by Benedict Palazzo Bertolone, and also participating in this effort has been Cécile Treffort, who is an expert at inscriptions. So today I'm going to mainly focus on the controversy that surrounds Père de la Croix and his interpretation of the site as a martyrium. And I would argue, in fact, that despite the fact that he was Belgian, he actually came from the city of Tournai, that the Père de la Croix identified very, very clearly with Poitiers and wanted to place Poitiers on the map of early Christian Gaul, that he wanted to show this was a site of great significance. And he was one of the most important advocates of this perspective in this time, but he certainly was not the only person. And here, a bit closer to Padova, many of you are no doubt familiar with Giovanni Battista di Rossi, who was excavating the catacombs in the same period. The two of them corresponded, and de Rossi was very supportive of what Père de la Croix was doing. With one caveat, he believed that the martyrs that were located in Poitiers were not Poitevin martyrs, but rather Roman martyrs who had been taken, their remains had been thus taken to Poitiers, by what means I'm not entirely certain, but he contradicted Père de la Croix's argument only in this fashion. But I would suggest that there was a network of early archaeologists during this period who were in touch across Western Europe, who corresponded with one another and lent one another support for this ideological stance of the importance of Christianity in this early period, a stance that they were taking for also very modern reasons. In the case of de Rossi, the catacombs played a very specific role in Vatican politics in tracing certain areas under their possession. And Père de la Croix, I would argue, is doing something on a much smaller scale, but an important one in Poitiers in a time when there was great controversy. Poitiers is located in an area of France where there are many Protestants, and it was also a time of increasing secularization in French society and pointing to living faith. In other words, sites, archaeological, physical sites of the faith were very important in terms of bolstering living faith in Poitiers. And if you go today into any of the churches in Poitiers, you see numerous inscriptions of people in World War I, World War II, who are thanking local saints such as Radegund or the Virgin Mary, in terms of her church there, who are thanking them for things that they received. And so I would argue that Père de la Croix wanted to make sure that Poitiers was an important part of this map. Now, there was an immediate reaction in France against the arguments that were made by Père de la Croix. And sorry, here's Père de la Croix again in a later painting of him. Here he's located inside of, I believe this is the baptistry of Poitiers. It's called the Baptistère Saint-Jean. And this site, he claimed, went back to the time of Constantine, an argument which is also no longer accepted. The baptistry has been redated probably to the 5th or the 6th century, but perhaps Alexandra knows more about the dating of it than I do. And here is Giovanni Battista de Rossi, who's working contemporary and was in regular contact with Père de la Croix and other people who were working on early Christian sites in Gaul. Now, there were many reasons for skepticism of the argument of de la Croix. One of the reasons is that there were several very well-known cases of fraud in France related to inscriptions and archaeological remains in the mid-19th century. One of them occurred in Poitiers in the mid-1850s when a man named the Abbé Aubert claimed that he had found in his garden, no less, an inscription that he dated to a very early period. And it was later determined that he himself manufactured the inscription, and this brought sort of great skepticism on sort of extraordinary claims that were being made at this time by archaeologists, because it was suggested that some of them were less than honest. The image I show you here of Charles and François Lenormand is a much more complicated case that's not linked to Poitiers, but occurred during this period. This is one of the most remarkable instances of academic malfeasance of this period. In 1854, Charles Lenormand, who is on the left-hand side, he's the father, who was the president of the Commission des Monuments Historiques in France, as well as a prominent member of the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, published a report on an alleged Merovingian cemetery, baptistry, and martyrium that he had found on his property in Normandy. Although his clever interpretation of the Merovingian remains was soon shown to be entirely impossible in two reports of a commission of the local antiquarian society in the region, no one dared to censure him. He was simply too important. And no one dared to censure his son either, who you see there on the right, named Francois, who went on to have a very successful career in French politics. In fact, very little word of the scandal got out of Normandy during the 1850s because the Lenormand family was so powerful that they were able to block publication of any sort of accusations in Paris during this period, and no one wanted to go on record against them because they knew it would be the end of their academic career. The allegations of the son, Francois, on the right's malfeasance. In fact, it was thought that he manufactured the site that his father interpreted. It's not clear to what extent Charles knew of the fraud, but these were not made public until after his death in 1884, when this was part of essentially the events that surrounded his commemoration after his death, when Gabriel de Mortillet, who was the director of the École d'Anthropologie, published a scathing obituary in which he accused the son, Francois, of being a forger. So you can get a sense, perhaps, of some of the skepticism then that people may have had towards Père de la Croix for making an extraordinary discovery, since there had been several claimed in the recent past by scholars that turned out to be forgeries. No one is accusing Père de la Croix of forgery here, but I would suggest to you that his reading was a very optimistic one. His desire to find something so badly may have led him, perhaps, to make a very strong case for something there was almost no evidence. And there were not too many people who continued to back him after his death. Now, another skepticism that was held of Père de la Croix had to do with the perception that he was reaching his conclusions too rapidly, and in fact that they were predetermined. Even before his publication of the site in 1883, scholars around France and also internationally cautioned him not to reach his conclusions too quickly. One of them was a man named Edmond Leblanc, who was responsible for the publication of the Christian inscriptions of Gaul in the mid-1850s. Leblanc presented Delacroix's finds for him at the Sorbonne in 1880, because this was very exciting news. And while these opportunities provided Delacroix with additional feedback, it's clear that there was a mixed reaction to his announcements. But despite these criticisms, and you can see Leblanc here is, I think, on the bottom in on the right-hand side in the front. He refused to change any of his conclusions aside from the dating. This is the point at which he shifts his dating of the site from the 4th century to the 6th, but he still continues to claim that this is a martyrium. The Jesuits seems to have been prepared from the very beginning to highlight the site's symbolic significance for Christian history, and he acknowledged, in fact, to his contemporaries that his religious calling informed his outlook as an archaeologist. He said that his research, and this is in a letter to Leblanc, he said that his research was aimed at the greater glory of God. So in a time when people were trying to argue that archaeology was a scientific practice, in fact, Père de la Croix was arguing that it also supported faith initiatives as well. Although Delacroix was insistent about the Hypogée's identification as a martyrial resting place, most were more skeptical. But it's interesting because very few of them did so publicly. They did so in personal letters to him, but they didn't call him out publicly in most cases, and said and continued to support him. And I would attribute to this to the fact that contemporaries describe him as incredibly charismatic, somebody people really liked even when they didn't agree with him. And he's a very public figure. In newspaper clippings he saved of himself in the departmental archives that we have today, he cut out many articles about himself, which of course is perhaps natural because people are interested in news about themselves, but you can see they come from across the spectrum. Even when people said they didn't really agree with him, they still said they liked him, and he was committed to Poitiers, and they liked that a lot, whether they agreed with him or not. And so, for instance, in the publication of Leblanc, he published a volume on inscriptions, the 3rd volume of his collection in 1892, and he left the identification of the Hypogée des Dunes intact as a martyrium. The only thing he changed was he agreed with de Rossi that the martyrs were indeed from Rome, and not from Poitiers. So, but it was after 1911, when Père de la Croix dies, that people finally begin to admit that there were some real significant problems with the site. One of the most famous was the medieval historian and chartiste Léon Levelin, who published a piece a few months after de la Croix's passing, and publicly questioned the Jesuit archaeologists' claim that this was the burial place of multiple martyrs from the region. Now, as I already mentioned to you before, this is not the only site that Père de la Croix was responsible for excavating. He excavated many places in Poitou-Charentes during this period, and many of them were in Poitiers itself. Just before the Hypogée des Dunes, and not all of them were Christian either, I should mention as well. He was responsible for what was known as the discovery of the Roman baths of Poitiers. One of his most famous finds was just outside of Poitiers at a site called Cinq-Cé, which was a Gallo-Roman temple site. This was arguably the most famous of his discoveries in this period, and it's said that tens of thousands of people went to the site in the middle of the countryside to visit the excavation. And one of the most important sites that he would dig, these are the baths here. I'm sorry, these are the baths here, and this is the baptistry. And this is probably one of the most important sites that he excavated, Saint-Jean in Poitiers, the exterior of which he excavated between the 1890s and 1902. This site he didn't discover, but he simply wanted to understand it better. And he rejected those who suggested this may have been formerly a pagan temple or a pagan mausoleum that had then been converted into a Christian site. And he said this was one of the earliest Christian sites to be found in France. And he dated it to just after Constantine's promulgation of the Edict of Milan, saying that this was important as well. An argument that goes closely with his argument for the Hypogée des Dunes. So it's clear that Père de la Croix's work was aimed at demonstrating that Poitiers had witnessed some of the earliest Christian activity in Gaul. He also encouraged other archaeologists in France to do the same. A man named Léon Coutil, with whom he had contact, was actually an archaeologist who specialized more in prehistory. He worked at a site called Les Andelys in Lure, and de la Croix advised his junior colleague that he had found a baptistry also. So you can see the politics of this, is that not only does he want to identify the sites he finds as being Christian, but also to encourage other nascent archaeologists in the west of France to do the same. And by the way, the site that was found by Coutil is no longer thought to be a baptistry. So here too, Père de la Croix got it wrong once again. But what I would suggest is that his work of this period may have been problematic, but that at the same time he was a very well-respected archaeologist is something that we have to keep in mind. And the tone, though, the reaction to his research in some circles took a much more antagonistic tone than we could expect on that basis alone. So, for instance, in 1884, de la Croix received a notice from the perpetual secretary of the Académie, who informed him that he would be denied a medal that people were expecting him to win because the commission could not embrace his conclusions. And while, for instance, in 1896, he was awarded with the appointment as a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur, which was a very important academic recognition during this period, and he was also appointed to the Comité des Travaux Historiques. He was later removed from the latter post without any explanation in the year 1902, which is in the very fraught years leading up to the separation of church and state in France, an event known as the Dreyfus Affair. So it's quite clear that his academic career became very caught up in the events of the early 20th century. Ernest Babylon, one of his colleagues in Paris at this time, who was then teaching at the Collège de France. Louder? Okay. Okay. You can't hear it? Okay.
You wait 1 minute.
Okay.
Because there's some people on.
Okay.
When you finish,
Uh-huh.
I'm going to make a
Okay. 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 So Ernest Babylon, who was at the Collège de France at this period, invited him to join an archaeological society he himself was forming in Paris. But at the same time, and said, you know, don't pay too much mind to those who are being unpleasant to you. So I would argue then that the backlash against Père de la Croix in this period went well beyond a criticism of faulty scholarship, but it had to do with discomfort with a clerical archaeologist who was arguing for early Christian sites in France. What remains to be seen was to what extent it was anti-clerical and to what extent it had to do with his research itself. In Delacroix's case, deprived of the opportunity to defend his work in some of the premier locations in Paris, the Jesuit argued, in fact, that this reaction was the result of discrimination rather than his scholarship itself. In some cases, even when his work was presented,
It's Italy, Bonnie.
okay, it's fine.
Let's profit 1 minute.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, are you sitting all there? Sit. I'm going to make you a small summary, also for the ones who stayed here and don't follow so much English. Okay, I think it's very clear. As I told you always during my lessons, we not only have to understand the remains, the archaeology, but also I always tell you, archaeology and history is connected with the time. We are making something because we are on a time, we are on a political moment, and all this has an influence on what we write and on how we interpret the things. And Professor EFFROS, that's very interesting, she's studying a archaeological site, Hypogée des Dunes in France, Poiters, something which is absolutely known. Everybody knows about this site, but she's showing how studying the historiography, studying the political context, studying the cultural context can help us to understand why somebody made an interpretation of this site. It's not that it's completely wrong, what he said, but it can help us to understand more how to make history. And that's what we have to make. We are archaeologists, we make history from objects, from buildings, but history is not always easy because we have to take care about all this context. So this Hypogée des Dunes is very important. It's a magnificent place with many inscriptions. It was discovered by this man, Père de la Croix, that you will hear a lot during the conference. And because of that moment, because of that particular moment on the history of Christianity, on the struggle between Protestants and Catholics,
And also between secular and religious.
and because secular and religious France, Rivoluzione Francese, and so on, he interpreted that building as a martyrium, you know, a place where martyrs are buried. And her problem is to understand why he said so, how other historians and archaeologists of this period struggled and discussed about this interpretation or not. So it's very interesting to see how a building can be interpreted as a martyrium or anything else because of the problem, because of his personal belief, and how the people accepted or not, depending on how times change. Okay, can we continue? Yes? In any case, you know that we are, oh my God, recording also my intervention. So from tomorrow you will have it online and you can see it again and again until you understand it. But we're going to talk about martyria and churches and so on during the course.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're
Sorry.
It's fine.
We have plenty of time.
Okay, thank you. So as I was saying before, the importance of understanding the site is also, it's a piece of it is to understand the struggles that Père de la Croix faced personally as a Jesuit in France during this period. So in 1880, just 1 year after the discovery of the Hypogée des Dunes, the Jesuits were deprived of, essentially, they had to disband in France. The Jesuits were banned. They had to evacuate their property. This is a letter that Père de la Croix received from one of his supporters roughly around this time. So it's an identification of his research and the support it lent to Christianity and the personal circumstances that the Jesuits faced at this very moment. So with this blow to their influence, in fact, Père de la Croix lost his place of residence. He clearly saw himself as under attack, and so his argument on behalf of this site became all the more important. So de la Croix saw anti-clericalism on a national level. It affected Jesuits across France, but it also had an effect on the events in Poitiers itself. Now, the Belgian Jesuit resided in Poitiers for a period of 47 years, and so he had a very close identification with his adopted city. And in the city, from the clippings that he saved among his papers, it's quite clear that de la Croix was following local events having to do with the status of Christianity in Poitiers, and saw it as being connected to his excavations as well. What you see here in this older postcard, unfortunately, I don't know the date of this. I found this one online. But it's quite clear that in 1887, some of you may be familiar with, are you familiar with Radegonde of Poitiers? Radegonde, one of the most important early medieval saints. She died in 587 in Poitiers. She was a former queen who founded a monastery in Poitiers that was later dedicated to the Holy Cross because of a relic that she was able to procure from Constantinople. The cult of Radegonde is very, very strong even today in Poitiers, and there's still a nunnery that's dedicated to Radegonde's memory. And in 1887, there was a procession and a consecration of a new statue of this medieval saint, an act that was sanctioned by the Pope, Leo XIII, and it sparked a near riot in the plaza of the cathedral in Poitiers. So this is in 1887, just 9 years after the discovery, 8 years after the discovery of the Hypogée des Dunes. So it's clear that de la Croix identified this site not just with the national situation of the Jesuits, but also with religiosity in Poitiers itself, okay? Whether associated with Radegonde or with the baptistry or with what he thought was the very important martyrium located at the Hypogée des Dunes just outside the city. Nonetheless, he continued his excavation in the region, and he was fiercely dedicated to Poitevin history. And with that, he earned the respect of the journalists publishing at this time in Poitiers, who suggested that he was unique among those of the epoch, that he was willing to do the physical labor of excavation. He didn't just leave it to others, and that the population of Poitiers loved him very deeply. And in a piece dedicated to him in the public news in this area, He was described as not lacking any glory, that he was one of the most prominent archaeologists of this period. In fact, this journalist who identified himself actually as a Republican said that he would rather spend time with Père de la Croix than spending time with the Freemasons, who at this time were advocates of secularism in the region. And they published, for instance, in 1896, when he was made a chevalier, a knight of the Légion d'honneur. They gave him a laudatory poem in the local paper in his support. Now, what's quite extraordinary about Père de la Croix, and the only reason I was able to do this study, is because of his archives. At the time of Père de la Croix's death, he left his possessions, what he still owned, including the Hypogée des Dunes, but also massive correspondence that he kept with his contemporaries, and he gave them to the Société des Antiquaires de l'Ouest, who have now deposited them in the departmental archives of the Vienne, the region in which Poitiers is found. So these archives have allowed me and other scholars to reconstruct what we can find out about his life and how it affected his work as an archaeologist. And the correspondence is incredible because normally when we work on archives, it only includes the letters that a person received. But Père de la Croix kept notes of all the letters he sent out. And so you can see the back and forth and the discussion. It's really interesting. They're kind of scribbled because they were just for himself. Very frequently, they're on the backs of like funeral announcements and other events he was attending. It's on scrap paper. But nonetheless, it's very important because we know the questions he asked people and how he responded to their questions. Not in every single case, but it's quite comprehensive. There are, I would say, I don't know how many hundreds of letters, but it's quite remarkable. So through his correspondence, we can see that this issue of struggle was a theme that lasted throughout the rest of his career. Scholars like Léon Levillain, who I mentioned already, wrote to him and told him not to be discouraged, that his work would go on. And I've translated a small section. He said, "Courage, my Reverend Father, do not give up, but continue to scatter the seeds of new ideas to the world. Some of them have already ripened and have entered into the stream of taught truths. Others will yet germinate and flourish. And even if there are some seeds that fall on sterile earth and are dispersed by the wind, the harvest will still be fair enough to ensure the scholar that you are a place of honor among archaeologists." And so Levinas did not actually agree with what most of Père de la Croix argued, and after his death he would finally publish that. But nonetheless, he was saying to his friend, even if not all of your ideas take seed, you will be remembered. You will be remembered among archaeologists. So it's clear that de la Croix and his supporters attributed his difficulties to anti-clerical sentiments of this period, and with good reason. But what's interesting is if we compare the Hypogée des Dunes with one of the few sites that we know of in France that might be seen as comparable. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the burial church that's found in Jouarre, just to the east of Paris. It's very close to Euro Disney, if you ever get there. The Church of Jouarre is a very important one in comparing the sites, because it also is a subterranean crypt, but it's part of a more known tradition because it's documented in early medieval sources, and was part of a very important monastery founded in the 6th century outside of Paris. This was excavated between 1869 and 1871, also by a cleric, but a local parish priest named the Abbé Tiercelin. Unlike de la Croix, however, Tiercelin did not try to make himself famous. He was not trying in the same way to get the kind of publicity that Delacroix was doing at Poitiers. Moreover, because it was a site linked to a known saint, a woman named Théodechilde from the Merovingian period as well, these figures were not something that appeared with no historical background. So the site of Jouarre was not nearly as controversial. The canonesses at this house continued to play an important role in conjunction with the burial site. Let me just give you a little bit of the larger picture of archaeology in this period so you get a little bit of a sense of the academic circumstances in which Père Delacroix was operating. In the 19th century, unlike today, archaeology was not taught in universities. There were no courses on archaeology until the late 1870s, when the first courses were taught on classical archaeology. Medieval archaeology happens much, much later. This is important to keep in mind so that you understand the context in which Delacroix was working as an archaeologist and any of the archaeologists that you work on in this period. People worked by training in the field, usually digging on their own property or digging on the property of people who'd given them permission to excavate. They learned by trial and error. And most of them, I should point out too, didn't actually do the digging. They paid agricultural laborers to go into the field and dig for them, and they would check up on them every few days. There was no methodology for the most part. Okay? There was no understanding of stratigraphy, very little at this period, and they had no way to date the sites in questions unless they found coins. And even then, it was still problematic because there wasn't a very clear way of understanding how coins related to the burials in question. So the place where archaeological research happened in this period was in archaeological societies. These were organizations. You may be familiar. I'm sure there must be some in Padova as well. They were located in most of the cities across France. And usually they consisted of landowners, priests, judges. They were people of a sort of middle class, lower nobility who joined these organizations. They were interested in local history primarily and local archaeology, and they published so you had to be invited to join one of these societies. You had to have two people propose your name. The group would have a vote. So it was a sign of status to belong to these archaeological societies, and it propelled people like Père Delacroix sort of to a circle of people who were interested in the same questions. Some of them wrote on history. There was a pretty eclectic group of publications that would emerge. It reflected what kinds of finds there were in a local area. So Père Delacroix's work largely happened in these areas. In France, these organizations appear mostly from the 1830s forward, promoted by a man named François Guizot, who was the Minister of the Interior in France after the July Revolution of 1830. So after the French Revolution, essentially, the French were very interested in knowing where archaeological remains were located in France and also monuments, because they wanted to know what had survived the revolution, what didn't, and what needed to be preserved, what needed to be safeguarded in a period of industrialization. As France was industrializing, it was necessary then to take measures to protect these sites as the cities grew. So Père Delacroix was part of this world, and there was great concern over the role that priests would play in the kind of archaeological societies that would consist of men who essentially, it was I have found very few women before the early 20th century. These were male institutions, although sometimes women are recorded as going with them on archaeological outings that they would do. This was male-centered. Clerics played a very important role in these organizations, in some places representing 2 to 5%, but in some societies they represented as much as a quarter of the organization. So this was a period of significant change in France. The Archaeological Society in Poitiers was founded when the city of Poitiers tried to tear down the baptistry. This seems to us as sort of unimaginable, the idea of pulling down a late antique structure like this to make way for new buildings, but this was very much the case in Poitiers and the rest of France throughout the 19th century. And in fact, if you go to Poitiers today, you can only find a few of the arches of the former theater that was located in the city. That was torn down in the 1870s, okay? So there were no safeguards really in France for antiquities until the 1870s, 1880s. And so this is why the archaeological societies were so important, that they were created to save such sites. But as some of you who might be familiar with the figure of Viollet-le-Duc know that all efforts at conservation were not equal, and that many of the efforts that were undertaken during this period by architects like Viollet-le-Duc and not by archaeologists were in fact very problematic for these structures. Viollet-le-Duc, you may know, was famous for his reconstruction of medieval sites to a state that these monuments had never existed in during this period. And Père de la Croix had a very different attitude towards it. He was not trying to restore the Hypogée des Dunes to what it once was. He was interested in trying to preserve it in a certain moment in time, but what made him somewhat different is the way in which he attached religious significance to the site as well. Now, not all clerics in this period were making similar arguments. Another person to whom I might draw your attention is the Abbé Cochet, who was also very important during this period for excavating Gallo-Roman and Merovingian sites. He was also a cleric. He was a parish priest, essentially, although he no longer fulfilled this function. And he excavated cemeteries. But what makes his work radically different from that of Père de la Croix is that he was not looking for Christians. In fact, when he found what looked like Christian remains, he usually said, well, maybe they were Christian, but not very good Christians, because Christians would not be buried with grave goods, and so these couldn't have been very good ones, and that the Franks were not very good Christians before the period of Charlemagne. So he didn't excite the same kind of controversy that someone like Père de la Croix did. And he's a generation earlier. You could argue, in fact, part of this has to do with the rising anti-clericalism later in the century. I would assume that that's an important piece of it. But I also think it has to do with the field of research in question. This was not nearly as controversial because he wasn't looking for Christians or trying to make that sort of argument. And he played a very important role in the northwest of France. And he later became the curator of the Musée départemental des Antiquités de Rouen in 1867, and he dies in 1875, so really before Père de la Croix's work begins to take off. So it's perhaps not the most fair comparison to make between the two men, but what it's important to note is that Cochet's work made lasting contributions to French archaeology. One of his main contributions had to do with efforts in France during this period to create a chronology, an absolute chronology for dating early medieval cemeteries. So his work made a contribution in a way that was much broader than the sites that he excavated. People looked to Cochet's work, exported his ideas to their own excavations, something that's rather different also than the case of the use of the Hypogée des Dunes by Père de la Croix in the subsequent generation. And I should note, those of you who are interested in sort of the after history of this in the early 20th century, there was a very famous archaeologist named Édouard Salin, who wrote a very important book called La Civilisation Mérovingienne in 1952. And his work borrows much more heavily from that of Cochet, whereas Père de la Croix does not receive much mention because of the methodological advances that he made. So let me draw some conclusions for you. Is that okay? Yes? Okay. So, what relevance then? Why is an American American historian interested in archaeology so obsessed with Père de la Croix? Why should anybody care? I would argue that that first of all, one reason that would suggest that I shouldn't look at Père de la Croix is that his excavations have had very little reverberation. In other words, at the time of his death in 1911, many of his ideas were discredited. The Hypogée des Dunes, as a site, doesn't have so much impact in France, largely because it's so unusual. You can look at the case of Jouarre, but other than that, there aren't too many mausolea that date to the early medieval period that bring together inscriptions, images, statues in one location. It's not a site that works well in terms of the dominant paradigm in the 20th century of early medieval archaeology, which focuses on the question of Gallo-Romans versus Franks. This site doesn't tell us really anything that's immediately apparent about these contradictions. So in large part, he was important in his own day, but not many people today know who Père de la Croix is or even care. So his discussions were largely disconnected from what became the mainstream attitude towards archaeology of this period, and particularly after 1905, with the separation of church and state in France, people didn't want to ask these kinds of questions. This was not a relevant issue for this time. It didn't really lend itself well to discussions of the early medieval period, or at least the ones that people wanted to have in the early 20th century. So that limited Père de la Croix's impact. But at the same time, I'm intrigued by the example of Père de la Croix because it tells us about the genesis of a discipline, the discipline of archaeology in France. Although this is perhaps an offshoot of it that is not as important that in the 20th century as that looking at things like ethnic identity. But then nonetheless, it has an important tale to tell us now about our role as academics, whether we're archaeologists or historians, and how the events of our time influence the way we go about doing our work. We all live in a moment, and there's no way to escape that moment, and really no reason to try to. At the same time, though, I think it's very important to be aware of what that moment is and how it may affect the work that we do. This is Père de la Croix's reconstruction in his mind of what the Hypogée des Dunes looked like at the time it was built. And this is completely his imagination of the exterior, because none of these parts of the Hypogée des Dunes exist. Okay, so this is how he imagines people came upon this site in late antiquity. Camille de la Croix may be an isolated example of the backlash against ideological scholarship in a time of rampant anti-clericalism, but he still has lessons to teach us. Although antipathy towards clerics shaped the work of archaeologists by defining what the parameters of their work might be, de la Croix nonetheless achieved great success during his lifetime through a combination of his bullheaded perseverance, that he stuck with his ideas, he was incredibly stubborn, and also because he had powerful colleagues who supported his work, at least during his lifetime. So despite his allegations of being wronged on a regular basis, he was still remarkably influential, and the sites that he excavated were too important to simply be dismissed and written off. Even if his colleagues found themselves in the awkward position of berating his biased interpretations at the same time as praising his finds, his work had importance in his day, and that the Hypogée des Dunes on the outskirts of Poitiers was one of the first examples, even if not as early as he suggested, of an archaeological site that required multidisciplinary methodology in order to understand its mix of inscriptions, human remains, grave goods, and architecture. Many contemporaries simply did not know what to make of a site that was so exceptional, that didn't fit into the paradigm of Frank versus Gallo-Roman, and that attested to a tradition that incorporated both the cult of martyrs as well as grave goods, which were also found in the site. So it was really, in this sense, an enigma. So this factor may be one of the reasons that it's only in the past 5 years that scholars began a detailed reevaluation of the site. Ultimately, Delacroix's insufficient caution in preferencing some kinds of evidence over others in his vision of the early Christian church in Gaul revealed his bias and subverted the importance of the very site that he sought to promote. As much as his contemporaries recognized the importance of the Hypogée des Dunes, few could wholeheartedly embrace the adoption of this site by a Jesuit as a symbol of cleric struggle to assert their legitimacy as scientists in learned societies, academies, and ultimately universities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think this was a very interesting conference, a very interesting argument. So thank you. So there's some questions to Professor EFFROS, so we can make a little bit of discussion about this theme that I think is important to understand. So also the evolution of our studies and our subject, archaeology. So there's some question.
Yeah, if I can say something, not a question, I would like to add, it was for me at least, exceptional conference. Many of you also, the smaller one, have heard much of it. I like to invite people to talk for everybody so that they have a different look at things, but at the same time, many of you probably have thought, oh, Alexandra said already this, or we have talked about this. So how important is for us? Maybe it's boring sometimes. Probably it's much boring when I explain it. Then Professor EFFROS, historiography. How important is to know when a place was found, how it was interpreted, how interpretation of a place can change, and it helps us, as she said, to understand also our role in society, how the things we say about a place can be important for future generations, and how these interpretations we make are completely shaped, transformed by our political context. Another thing that I liked a lot, it was the part or the area talking about archaeological societies. I tell you a lot, archaeological groups of people who are doing archaeology now, we have to work with them because they have a long knowledge of local archaeology, but still more important, they are the fathers of archaeology. Before university or archaeological teachings in the university existed, there was already these people, noble, bourgeois, aristocracies, and so on, that started making history. And that's something we should never forget. Of course, they had another methodologies, they had other ways to do things, but the most important thing, in my opinion, was their interest on preserving heritage, something that we sometimes forget. We are not just reconstructing history, we are trying to give a value to some things in order that the future generations still can count with those things, and they did it long ago, much before we started talking about public archaeology and that kind of things. So thanks a lot. I just remember, and now we will open questions. On Friday, we're going to have another conference. As you see, well, Professor EFFROS is a specialist also on burials and on archaeological materials, but I'm trying to focus all the conferences this year in these aspects you don't have in your academic plans, which is historiography and all the problems that shape history. So on Friday, just triennial have to be there at 8:30, but if somebody else wants to come, she's going to talk about something that I find absolutely interesting: nationalism, archaeology, and what happens when people from Europe goes to other places and creates their history. Remember, all the museums in Europe are full of objects from that time. When we went there, well, Spanish not so much, but French and Italian and British and Germans went to other countries to make archaeology, why they went to Africa, or why they went there, what history did they want to create, and what consequences it had. We have now still consequences in some places, so a very interesting subject. I hope some of you will discover this world of historiography, of reading letters, of archaeologists. We have many letters and many archives of old archaeologists that are still there. Their families have them, and we just have to study this. It's long and difficult, but it's not paleography, so it's not in Latin many times. It's in Italian. So just tell me.
Thank you for your good panorama of the French archaeological research in the 19th. I have a question about money. Where Père de la Croix found money to his research and especially the excavation?
So this was a perennial problem for archaeologists in this period. Père de la Croix is an interesting case because as a Jesuit, he was given housing by the Jesuit order, and he was given essentially room and board. He also, I don't know so much about his earlier life. In fact, in the fall in Tournai, there's going to be an exposition in the city of Tournai where he was born about his early years and about the archives they've found. He seems to have come, though, from some wealth, because the fact that he was able to buy the property on which the Hypogée des Dunes was located suggests that he had money that was not part of his income from the Jesuits. So in his case and that of many other clerics, what they had was time. He apparently was excused from most of his duties as a cleric because of his archaeological work and the fact that the church and the Jesuit order thought these were very important. So in fact, his time was largely his. He was excused from most of his teaching duties so that he could dig. So in fact, he didn't need all that much money in order to excavate. He did some of the work himself, and he also paid agricultural laborers to do some of the heavy lifting. In those cases, in the work that in the papers I've been able to find, not particularly located or linked to the Père de la Croix, but to some of his contemporaries, the going wage was about £1 a day. And so for a person, I mean, the most expensive wages I've seen paid for this kind of archaeological work were under Napoleon III, who people complained was paying his workers 3 francs a day. So £1 a day is not all that much. These were people in the off season. They weren't harvesting, they weren't planting, so they were available to do this kind of work. So if one had access to a couple hundred francs, it was in fact possible to do archaeological work on a very small budget. It was local. He didn't have to travel far to get to the site. And he probably wasn't at the site every single day, but it was the workers who did some of this themselves. I don't have evidence on where the money came from, but I would suggest it was either extra income he had as a result of being a Jesuit, personal income that he brought with him from his family, or possibly the Archaeological Society may have given him some money, knowing that eventually they would receive it. Now, the archaeological societies during this period had a lot of difficulty in raising funds to operate. Most of the funds they received were from membership dues. They got very little from the government. If an archaeological society was very well known, they might get 300 francs a year from Paris, but that's it. So most of the money came from members who paid, usually depending upon the society, between 10 and 30 francs per year. So that by that means these societies could raise, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000, 2,000 francs, but most of that money went towards their publication. That's the one thing that was really, really expensive in the late 19th century. It was paying for their journals to be published. In other words, the printing of the journals, the typography was very, very expensive, and the paper as well. So my guess is he self-funded this because we don't have any evidence that he received money to do so. He did win 1 or 2 prizes. It's possible those came with money, but those were after the excavation of the Hypogée des Dunes. So in large part, I would say, I can't tell you for sure, but I think largely self-financed. So does that sort of answer your question? But that's what a lot of the correspondence of this period is about, is trying to get money from Paris, usually from the Minister of Public Instruction, and not much of the money usually filtered its way down to the provinces. Where the money was in big excavations in the period, for instance, of Napoleon III, which he used the money that he had as emperor in his personal, the budget he could spend freely, and that's where you see large expenditures. But that's the exception, like Alésia. That is very unusual. Most digs during this period were small scale. They were done by a single excavator with several workers. It's quite different than what you see, and this is what I'll talk about on Friday, are colonial excavations where they're using soldiers or they have funds from the Ministry of War that allow them to do larger scale excavations. So Père de la Croix in that sense was quite typical, that if you were middle class, you had some income, you could do it. I don't have what many of them did was they self-financed their digs by selling off the objects afterwards, but I don't think that's the case in Père de la Croix because the objects had religious significance to him and he was not sort of sharing them around. But the Abbé Cochet, for instance, did sell some items or he exchanged them in exchange for others. And there are many less reputable archaeologists in this period who simply would, at the end of a season, they would sell off their objects or they would sell off those that were duplicates. There's no sense that you have to retain everything the way it's understood in France today, that is part of the national patrimony, and so it cannot be given away or sold, that it all has to be retained. So it's a very different approach in this period.
Other questions?
If Delacroix detractors try to give a counter-interpretation to the Hypogée des Dunes site.
What kind of interpretation did their detractors say?
So nobody disputed the fact that this was an early medieval site. But when he made the argument that this was martyrs from Poitiers, people wanted to know his evidence. And the main source of his argument was this painted inscription, there, which unfortunately no one saw except Père de la Croix. Because underneath this inscription, and I don't have the image of the other one, there was an inscription underneath. And so he wanted to see the oldest one. So he erased this one. And he didn't take a photograph of it, even though photography existed in this period in Poitiers. And we have many pictures of Père de la Croix at this period. So it's not that he didn't know any photographers. So the question is, why? why, if this was the main argument, that this is a martyrium, you can see over on the right-hand side, I believe it's on this one here, that it refers, you see, it says 72, yeah, all the way over at the left. Yeah, it says it's on the second line from the bottom. That's the crucial line. So the question is whether we believe this or not. And so nobody has said that he's a forger. Some people have suggested it's no coincidence that this inscription no longer survives except for a drawing in his book. So the question is really what to do. And this is part of the reason that the site is being restudied today. So in revisiting the excavation, the archaeologist Bénédicte Palazzo Bertolone was asking the question, what did Père de la Croix really do with the site? They went back through his old plans, and then they re-excavated in the hopes of re-understanding it. Now, it's a very complicated site because he excavates it in 1879, exposes it, and it immediately begins to deteriorate. And he calls upon the Archaeological Society. He says, you have to help me. We have to do something because the site is breaking down in front of our eyes. It used to be brightly colored. The color's disappearing. The stones are getting worn out. Can you help me by building a cover over the Hypogée des Dunes? Because he couldn't afford to do it himself. The society didn't do anything. So Père de la Croix filled it back in with dirt. Okay? He took all the fill that had been outside, piled it back into the grave. And then
He excavated and then put the earth again because it was destroying itself.
right. And so what happened was that when the Archaeological Society finally agreed to build a new cover in the early 20th century, he said, fine, I'll re-excavate it. Okay, so a man named Formigé, I guess is a quite well-known architect, built a cover over the Hypogée des Dunes to protect it from the elements, and he re-excavated it. But part of the problem then too is that now you're talking about two excavations on the same site. Things got moved around inside. The context, the layers, all of it is very problematic. Okay, so Bénédicte really had quite a task in front of her in trying to interpret the site, and also his maps his drawings of the site. The diagrams don't match up where things were located inside the tomb anymore. Except, some things were still there, but some were not. And as you can see, there are things that were changed. Like, so you see the metal support that's behind part of the arch. Right here. Obviously things were changed. And also, when Formigé built the structure that's around it today, also they dig in order to put up a wall, right? And so that also messed up the context of the site. So it's very, very complicated. And so the question is, what were his contemporaries reacting against? Part of it had to do with the lack of evidence and the inability to reproduce the evidence he was arguing that this was a site. Now, it's quite likely, because this is true of many churches of the period, that there were some relics inside this, and nobody's disputing that. So there could have been, what people were saying is there could be relics that came from Rome, but that doesn't make this a martyrium. This simply makes it a mausoleum, a burial place. And that's the extent to which people were, besides pushing him later, saying there's no way this is 4th century, this is 6th or 7th century, which people agree on now. But the other thing that they were disputing is saying, well, there's no historical evidence that suggests this. You can't provide the image that says this. So why should we believe this? So people were willing to embrace the fact that it was a mausoleum, that it was an important one, that maybe people wanted to be buried there ad sanctos. But what they were saying that was unlikely was this idea that suddenly there were these 72 martyrs that nobody had ever heard of, that just happened to be located in Poitiers on the basis of a fresco that didn't exist anymore. Because the earlier one underneath it doesn't say that at all. Okay, the earlier one underneath shows that it was a burial spot. It's only the later version that he claims, the later version. Now, the new publication that's going to be coming out on this topic, they are not saying that he's a forger. They've been very careful not to do that because it's probably not a very nice thing to say about one of the founding archaeologists. And because we can't prove that he forged it either. We don't have the proof that shows that he made it up. All we have is it's what we have. So, so I don't think a lot of the problems with this site are ever going to be resolved. But unfortunately, if you go to Poitiers, the site is closed today because they're having a lot of problems with moisture inside. They're having a lot of problems with salt plume, and also with various kinds of fungus that are growing on the inside. And until they master the issue that has to do with the climate inside of it, it's closed to the public. So, so unfortunately, I can't encourage you to go to Poitiers and see it because I don't know when it's going to reopen. So.
So I think we don't have time anymore. So thank you, Professor EFFROS. Thank you. And thank you to all of you. So thank you.